have Ed Farley, and he's going to talk to us about pink salmon. And I'm actually pretty excited about this one because we were inundated in the Bering Strait region with pink salmon this year. And two, it's a climate success story. So I think I want to hear something that sounds like these guys are doing really well, which we can see that they are in the Bering Strait region. And we're really interested to hear how you do it, how you tell, and why they might be doing so well given our changing conditions. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Ed Farley, who is he's the NOAA Fisheries biologist in the Juvenile Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and he's the program manager for the Ecosystem Monitoring and Assessment Program. And if you're into acronyms, that would be NOAA Fisheries EMA. With that, take it away, Ed. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Gay. I'm going to share my screen now, make sure everybody can see the presentation. So can someone say yes, they see it?
Yes, we see you. For a sec there. Now you're good. Thank you so much.
All right, it's so thank you again for inviting me to a Strait Science Talk. I think this is my third one that I've given over the years. And tonight I'm going to talk about response of pink salmon to climate warming in the northern Bering Sea. This is some of the information from this presentation comes from a journal publication in Deep Sea Research Part 2. It's with myself and some colleagues, Jim Murphy, Chris Cecil, Ellen Yasumiishi, all with Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Juneau. I have Karen Dunmall, who's with Fisheries and Oceans Canada in Winnipeg, Todd Sformo, who's with the North Slope Bureau, and Pete Rand, who works at the Prince William Sound Science Center in Cordova. Some of the data I'm going to show here today are time series data, and we've collaborated quite heavily with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game on some of the information I'm going to present today. But we also rely on a number of other partners because we don't have full funding for this. So I want to make sure I get everyone acknowledged here, because we have used funding from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the North Pacific Research Board, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCES. We've received funding from AYK, SSI, Arctic Yukon Kuskokwim Sustainable Salmon Initiative, from the Bering Sea Fishermen's Association, Alaska Sustainable Salmon Fund, Yukon River Drainage Fishermen's Association, Coastal Impacts Assistance Program. We've worked closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a seabird observer that comes on our surveys. So there's a lot of information that comes out of the surveys, not just focused on pink salmon, but other information. We have partnerships with Pacific Marine Environmental Lab for helping us with some of the oceanographic data, and with the North Slope Bureau. So with that, you can see that it takes a lot of people and agencies to help us get information out of the northern Bering Sea. So I hope everybody can see the next slide. This is a slide that I put together. It was about 5 years ago, and I think it's really an interesting slide. So again, we're looking at loss of seasonal sea ice and warming sea temperatures in the northern, or the Bering Sea, northern Bering Sea, and Chukchi Sea. And this slide from about 5 years ago, we showed what the average months of open water was in the northern Bering Sea and Chukchi, and it was about 3 months, and that's on average from 2004 to 2013. However, when I presented this, there was a climate model that they used, and in 2020, they estimated that there would be about 4 months of open water based on that model. And then by 2040, there would be about 5 months of open water. However, you know, those of you who live in the region and those of us that are studying up there, we know that the model's not actually getting us where we're at now. In fact, we're exceeding everything that these models were predicting. If you just look at this photo from Seth Danielson that shows 5 April 2019, we've seen some years where there hasn't been ice in winter in the northern Bering Sea and parts of the Chukchi. So we're already exceeding some of these climate model estimates. And that's going to have profound impact, as many of you know, on the ecosystem, because ice drives some of the ecosystem dynamics. It cools the water down. So if you have warmer water, less ice, some of the things that we've seen changing now are fish that are more southerly oriented or beginning to move north up into the northern Bering Sea. There have been some changes in the food web. And there are some fish that are doing better and some fish that are doing not as good. And so today I am going to focus on some of the fish that are doing a little bit better, which is pink salmon. And I'm just going to briefly go into the life history for pink salmon, just to get everybody, on the same page. We've got these remarkable fishes, these animals. They have a 2-year life history. They spend about 1 year in fresh water, and that's after they spawn. We have eggs, and then the eggs hatch sometime in spring. Those hatch turn into smolt, and then the smolt leave the fresh water and enter the marine environment sometime around June. And then they spend a little more than a year in the marine ecosystems, and they go from what we call the juvenile life stage, which is that stage for that first ocean year, to adult when they come back the following year. And I think that just this picture right here highlights just how remarkable pink salmon are. I mean, when we're out there in our survey, we're catching what we call juvenile salmon. You can see the size of those fish. They're quite small. And then 1 year later, when those fish come back to spawn, they have grown so much. And so you can see that they are voracious. They have to be voracious feeders while they spend this time in the marine ecosystem in order to make it back the following year and spawn that size. The other thing that's really interesting about these 2-year life histories is that they're a separate population. They are separate populations. So you have an odd year population, and then you have an even year population, and there is no overlap. And that's going to come into play a little bit later in the talk. And then I just wanted to provide just a brief informational on the current salmon distribution and some abundance information. And the big picture here is this figure is from the state of the salmon, and it shows in green the current spawning distribution. So you can see that pink salmon have a broad spawning range, from the southern locations all the way up into the Bering Sea, Bering Strait region. There is some limited spawning that's shown in sort of that orangish yellow color. That's up in the high Arctic area. There's some historic spawning distribution down on California, Oregon, and southern Washington. And it's historic because they don't seem to have any production coming out of those rivers anymore. And then if you go to this darker blue section, so the pink salmon that spawn in those freshwater habitats leave and enter the marine environment, and they're covering a wide range within the North Pacific. So these populations, either from Asia or from Alaska or Canada, pretty much disperse across the ocean during winter. And if you just kind of give a understanding of abundance of salmon, so there's a paper that's been out by Greg Ruggiero and Jim Irvine. It was published in 2018. And in that paper, they had this figure that shows salmon abundance in millions. This is adult salmon abundance. And then they also had the salmon biomass. And then in that figure C, which is on the lower right-hand corner, they included the immature salmon biomass. And so these are the 3 mostly abundant salmon species. It's pinks, chum salmon, and sockeye salmon. And chum salmon and sockeye salmon spend more than 1 year in the ocean. So if you're spending more than 1 year in the ocean, you can go through what's called an immature life stage. So some of the things that we note here, at least for the abundance of adult salmon, is that in the last 20 years, abundance has been very high in the North Pacific. And pink salmon are definitely the winners there. If you go to the adult biomass, again, this is weight in thousands of metric tons. Pink salmon also are highly the most weight in terms of biomass in the ocean. But when you include all the other immature fish that are in the ocean, it's chum salmon that really stand out as being the highest in terms of biomass. So just kind of place that in context. So it's the fish from the northern Bering Sea region, when they leave their fresh water, they enter this region of the northern Bering Sea, and they spend their first summer at sea feeding and growing. Sometime in late fall and through winter, they migrate down through the Bering Sea and past the Aleutian Islands, and they end up spending winter down here in the North Pacific Ocean. And that winter is, that area is an area that a lot of these other fish stocks are also intermingling in. So these fish from the Northern Bering Sea are intermingling with stocks from Asia, from the Gulf of Alaska, and Canada. And then once winter's over, pink salmon, because of their 2-year life history, begin to migrate back to the Northern Bering Sea and begin to spawn sometime around July, August up in the river systems that you all live near, some of you do. So with that, let's go on to the next one here. So I mentioned some of this marginal habitat that's up in the high Arctic, and that, you know, there's information that we can gather from the Inupiaq people that have lived there for thousands of years, and they know that in their subsistence framework that they've been utilizing pink salmon for a very long time. There are a couple of documents that are publications that came out, one by Carruthers in 2013 that said since the late 1800s to present around Barrow, there's been presence, at least documented presence now in this paper. And then there's one by Stephenson from 2005, which documented from the early 1900s some presence in the Western Canadian Arctic, so over across the Beaufort Sea. We know, at least from the documents and from, you know, historic local knowledge, that numbers of pink salmon up in the high Arctic have been pretty low up until about the early 2000s. And now folks are finding pink salmon in subsistence nets more often than not up in the Chukchi and in the Beaufort Sea. And if you move over into the Western Canadian Arctic, the numbers were extremely low. If you look at this figure over to the right, it was provided by Karen Dunmall. You know, we go from the 1930s all the way up to about 2004, where there was just a handful of less than 5 that were spotted occasionally over there. But now we're seeing a lot more salmon showing up annually in the Western Arctic. And it's not really a lot, I guess, if you look at the numbers, it's less than 50, but it's still telling, because pink salmon not only are abundant in the North Pacific Ocean, but they're great at finding places to colonize. And so if there's new habitat that's forming up into the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea in terms of freshwater warming, they're going to find it. And then the real question is, are they successfully spawning here, or is this just a function of higher production down in the south and straying because they're needing to find new habitat? So while I'm not going to be able to address this, this is just some of the information just showing that it's likely being driven by straying, that these fish are moving up north, and it's straying because there's more production going on down in the southern regions. So moving now to the Northern Bering Sea and some of the data that we used for our paper and some of them in the models that we used. I'm going to talk first about the adult returns to the Norton Sound region. So this is, I worked with my Alaska Department of Fish and Game colleagues, and they said if we're going to use a time series that starts back in 95, or even look at some of the dynamics, we need to look at certain index rivers in the Norton Sound region. So they advised me to use the El Dorado, Snake, Nome, Aquinic, and the North Rivers. So that's where these data come from. I know that just looking at some of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game sites just more recently, that some other rivers up there are actually producing quite well too. But again, this was the 5 rivers that we used over this time series. And one of the things to note here is, again, remember we have an even year stock and an odd year stock. And you can see at least up until about 2005, and then again sometime around 2017, that even year pink salmon typically have a higher number of returns than the odd numbers. However, it's more recently we're seeing that the odd number fish are starting to come back in higher numbers, especially in 2017 and 2019, when some of this real warming has been going on. And I have some caveats in the end as to why I think this is happening. We also used data from the Yukon River. So we had the pink salmon returns from 95 to 2020. Again, this is an index for returns from Pilot Station and the Andrioski River, the East Fork. And again, that along the same as the Norton Sound rivers, you're seeing that the even year has the higher returns. And it seems that they've been increasing all the way through 2016. It's about 1.8 million. However, that's, that's not as many as what we're seeing to all these rivers that we've indexed in the Norton Sound area, but still quite a large number of pink salmon coming back to the Yukon River. And so the way we did this is we wanted to look at the total index of adult returns. So we added the Yukon River returns to the Norton Sound returns to give us a northern Bering Sea index of adult pink salmon returns. So one of the time series of data that I'll be using is the sum of these two adult return areas. And then to kind of tease out what's happening with pink salmon in this region, we need to really look at and focus on some of the critical life history stages. And one of those stages is freshwater, from egg to smolt. And in this case, there's a number of papers that have documented that pink salmon do better when they're in warmer freshwater environments. So in this case, we believe that the warmer freshwater environment will favor higher survival. Then when they enter the marine environment in the northern Bering Sea, it's essentially growing fast during that period, meaning that there's enough prey out there and that sea temperatures are warm enough for them, because their metabolism is going to be based on temperatures from the sea. So with food and higher temperatures, we expect them to grow faster, and the faster they grow likely helps them reduce predation risk. And then looking at their winter at sea, again, this is if you are growing as a juvenile in the northern Bering Sea and you've gained enough size and put on enough fat prior to leaving that part of the ecosystem and moving down to your winter habitat, we believe that if you've put on enough size and fat, then you've likely increased your survival chance through winter. So it's really this freshwater and then this habitat that's the northern Bering Sea that we believe is helping pink salmon, or could prove to help pink salmon have higher survival and higher production. All right, so along with the adult salmon data, we got other information from a survey that we've been conducting in the northern Bering Sea since 2002 up to present. So it's an annual survey. We've done it from about late August through September. We did not get out there in 2020, however, because COVID shut down a lot of surveys for the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. But the survey data that we do have comes from the northern Bering Sea, and we're out there to understand how loss of sea ice will affect the distribution, abundance, and fitness of fishes, seabirds, and mammals, and the food they depend upon. And the black dots that you see over on the left-hand side there on that figure of the northern Bering Sea, those are stations that we occupy. Now, this is just an average set of stations. We have occupied more stations in this in some years, but at each one of those black dots, we do collect information on the physical oceanography, the biological oceanography, or the food web. So we're looking at zooplankton. We also collect information on phytoplankton, the plants. And then we have a surface trawl that we use to collect fishes. And today I'm just telling you just a small story on pink salmon, but the fishes that we also collect include not only juvenile pink salmon, it's juvenile chums, juvenile Chinook, juvenile coho, juvenile sockeye, and some of the forage fish species such as herring and capelin. So we have the adult data. Now I'm going to show you just the results from our survey for the juvenile pink salmon distribution and relative abundance. Again, then the left-hand side, you can see there's a heat map here, and this map was based on the average catch per unit effort of the juvenile pink salmon that we captured during our survey. And you can see that most of the distribution is in sort of the center of our survey area of the northern Bering Sea. And then based on the annual catches, we can look at an index of abundance. This is a log index. It's not the actual abundance, so it's logged. And so that you can just see that there has been some variability. There's some high catches back in 2003 through 7, some lower catches from 2009 through 14, and then we've seen some increase in the number of juvenile pink salmon in our survey. So we have this adult data and we have the juvenile data. So how are we going to tease this out then in terms of some of the critical life history stages and try to understand what's driving production in this region? And so one way is to relate the number of adult spawners, pink salmon spawners, along with, we use NOAA air temperatures. We use that as a proxy for freshwater temperature in the region. We also had average sea temperatures during summer. And then we had juvenile salmon weight from our survey. And so in order for us to look at the freshwater to the early marine critical stage, we used those 4 indices and related those to the juvenile pink salmon index. And then in order to look at the winter critical stage, we took the juvenile index of abundance. We used sea temperatures during summer again, along with juvenile weight. And then we related those to adult returns the following year. So getting right into some of the results. This is the model that was best fit for looking at the freshwater to early marine critical stage. And the model suggested that the number of spawners and NOAA air temperatures explained approximately 55% of the variation of the number of juveniles that we're seeing in our survey. And more spawners, warmer temperatures mean more juveniles. If we move off into the critical stage of winter, we found that our juvenile index alone explained approximately 60% of the variation in the number of adult pink salmon returning the next year. And this is very interesting because it just suggests that there's been some fairly stable winter survival over the time series that we have. It also suggests that fish that we're catching are, at least, when we're seeing higher abundances, that these fish are retaining a size and a fitness that helps them survive winter. So I know that was a lot of buildup for just a couple of different slides here to kind of explain what's going on. But the take home here is that the freshwater to early marine conditions, especially freshwater, are likely driving production, and that warmer appears to be better. And that mortality during winter appears to be stable. And then again, I mentioned that at least for the Norton Sound area, there seems to be an increase in odd year pink salmon abundance. And this is a really important thing to note because there's been some studies looking at pink salmon and how they redistributed themselves after the last ice age. And so there was a paper by Chum et al. He's out of Canada, and he just said the difference in temperature tolerance between the odd and the even year brood lines has been linked to dispersal after the Pleistocene era some 10,000 years ago, where even year brood lines likely survived the glaciation in the northern refugia. So that means that if you survive that glaciation in the northern area and you're now attuned to cooler temperatures, you would expect to see even year production to be higher in these northern regions. And then the odd year brood line may have occupied more southern refugia. So now that we're seeing this odd year brood line take off, it seems that they had done best in some of the warmer conditions and had hid out during that last ice age in some of the warmer areas. And now that they're moving into these northern regions, although their production wasn't as high when it was cooler, now that we see it warming, we see some evidence that their production is increasing. And then just moving on to just one of the other major take-homes here is that our juvenile index of abundance appears to be a good predictor of the adult returns the following year. And we have a couple more examples that, or at least one more example of this from our survey that Jim Murphy and others have been working on. Maybe some of you have seen this before, but our survey also provides a juvenile Chinook salmon abundance index. And this is over on the left-hand side here. You can see the number of years that we have that juvenile index. We know that these juvenile Chinook are from the Yukon River. We do a genetic stock ID on those. And when we relate that juvenile abundance to the Yukon River returns 2 to 4 years later, we see an extremely good relationship between the juvenile abundance and the number of fish that are returning. And so from there, similar to what we're seeing with pink salmon, We use the Chinook salmon index to forecast future returns. And right now, one of the things that we're seeing in this warming event is a reduction in the number of returns for Chinook. And so while we're seeing a benefit for pink salmon, we're not really seeing any benefit right now in this warming environment for Chinook. At least that's what we think is happening. And we're doing a lot more, utilizing a lot more of our survey data to understand what's going on here. And then finally, one of the other abundance indices that we get out of our survey is Chum. And so we haven't taken this information yet and connected this to adult returns, but if there's some relationship here, it appears that our 18 and 19 indices is pretty much the largest we've seen since the beginning of our survey. And I'm not sure, but that could indicate higher returns in the future. So that's 25 minutes. It's pretty quick, and I have that's pretty much it for me. I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed. That was interesting to hear. And your slides are great. Oh, someone's coming in. They must have thought they'd catch you in the middle. But welcome. So I'll open it up to questions. I know I've got a couple questions, and but let's see if anyone else wants to go ahead first.
Okay, this is Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
So Ed, I was a fisheries manager in the 80s and 90s, and we used to, when we had small runs of pink salmon, we had large individual fish, like 3-pound average, and on the big runs, 84, 94, 2004, we had average weights down in the 2-pound range, and I kind of got that, you know, lots of fish compete for the limited food resources. But here in recent years, particularly this past summer, the coho salmon were just tiny, but they've been declining in size for a couple years. And I used to think that abundant pink salmon fry going to sea kind of gave the coho a kickstart, but now from what you've said, I'm wondering if the you know, maybe they give them a kickstart, but a little bit later in the life, they're direct competitors for the same food resources. Would that, have you looked at coho at all, or you see anything there?
Yeah, so I know that we've looked at coho salmon diets, and there doesn't seem to be much overlap with the pink salmon diets, and so these are the juveniles. As far as, you know, what's happening after they leave that shelf area in the northern Bering Sea, and if there's any competition after that, I'm not sure. I know that we're trying to look more into coho right now, but there's been more emphasis now to try to figure out some of the chum salmon dynamics, which is next.
Okay.
Kevin Clark has raised his hand.
Oh,
So-
I gotta raise my hand. Okay, wait.
Well, let's Kevin Clark go first, and then Animal Doctor, you're next.
Thank
Well,
you.
go
I
ahead,
just had
Kevin
a-
Clark.
Yeah, this is Kevin. I just had one really quick question. Now, when you're looking at the chum, just looking at that chum data that you had up, I noticed that, what was it, 2017 was a low year. Now, the juveniles that you were looking at when you're looking at that chum salmon data, now are those first year, would that be first year juveniles, or would that be like second or third year juveniles? That was my question.
Those are fish that have just entered the marine environment their first year, so they're going to return 2-3 years later.
Roger, because, you know, like this summer we saw a lack of 4-year-olds kind of in the data, what we saw for the return. So I just found that interesting. That was my question.
All right, and Animal Doctor, you had a question.
I did have a question. This is Rafaela from up in North Slope. So I work with fish, but mostly actually when they're dead. So excuse when I'm not as literate about that. My question is actually about so there are differences, right, in the temperature tolerance between these different salmon stocks. That's at least what I understand, that there has been, people have looked into that. So that's my first question of, that, that as a group, right, they'll be probably moving different based on how the Bering Strait or the overall water situation is going to change. And then my second question is for you, talking about these odd and even years. Could we actually look at them from where they originated from as actually kind of looking at them as ecotypes, right? That they come with a specific epigenetic setup, right? Whether it's now actual genetics or epigenetic, which is going to make them be more successful or less successful in this changing environment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Raphael. That's a really good question because at least from what we're seeing in the juvenile indices, we do have some information from the Chukchi Sea, and when it gets warmer in the Chukchi, we see higher numbers of juvenile pinks, especially in 2007. I don't know what happened that year, but boy, there were more juvenile pink salmon up in the southern Chukchi than we found even further south. I didn't show that information today, but we're working on those data right now and to include it in another paper looking at growth rate potential models, looking at the how warming in the ecosystem might impact growth potential and survival. And then, as the water warms up in the Chukchi and up in the Beaufort, especially during summertime, this is when salmon like pink salmon or chum salmon, they really take advantage of trying to find new habitat. And if there's a lot of production going on down south, you're likely going to see a lot of straying. And yes, I right now I would think that if there was going to be any success in the northern regions, it's going to be the even year stocks, because they tend to have a higher genetic tolerance for cooler freshwater temperatures. At least that's what we're seeing from the studies that were done. Versus the odd year, it's still maybe you're seeing this or not, but we need to find out whether or not there's been successful spawning in some of these rivers that drain into the Chukchi Sea or up in the Beaufort. I know that Karen is working on that right now, trying to understand any sort of where the winter habitat might be at in the Canadian Beaufort and in some of the rivers that are draining there.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering that. I mean, I know that I've, talking to fishermen up here, that, they definitely have spoken about that they've seen spawned out salmon, and they know what spawned out salmon look like up in the Ikpak River. And I thought that there was some work done by, NOAA Fisheries out of Juneau that actually looked at, and we're finding small, salmon, in the nearshore area, which may be suggestive. But for me, the strongest was really when people were talking about seeing spawned out salmon upriver, that I thought that was, of interest. I have one related question because we are talking about salmon. So one of the concerns, that at least on the, over in the Inuit region is, right, salmon are showing up there as well, and they're actually not a preferred fish, right? People are very concerned about how it's actually going to fare with the whitefish, and the, ciscos, the actual fish that people like, the, the chars and all of that. So do you have some thoughts on that? Just in a very general way.
Well, I think, based on the observations that you're seeing and others are seeing, that there are, more salmon showing up in subsistence nets, and it is, I think that we really think it's due to warming, and so this trend is likely going to continue. I don't know what impact that's going to have yet on other more preferred subsistence species.
Mm-hmm. One follow-up question, Gay, and then I shut up. But you said, so if I understood this right, that you said actually it's because of the high productivity in the Bering Strait that you actually have all of these fish that are looking for new habitat, right? And as long as they're not finding or successfully spawning up there, right? But it's actually driven by the Bering Strait. So if the current changes in the Bering Strait was the, coming, destruction of the cold pool and the coming of different predators, could that actually, lower the success of those salmon again? Meaning that it's always going to be like a seesaw in a way of what's happening in the Bering Strait is going to, it's not just temperature up in the Chukchi, but literally the productivity that's happening down there. Or maybe I misunderstood that.
Yeah, so it's productivity not only in the northern Bering Sea, but also on the Russian side. They're seeing a higher
Okay.
abundance of
Thank
pink
you.
salmon. And I didn't say that, but I know that they're experiencing that. And when you start to see streams that, I know Gay has said that there's 2 million fish returning to a small stream. Well, not all those fish that would have come back, they're going to want to continue to try to spawn in that river because it's already at capacity. They're going to leave and try to find other spawning habitat. Pink salmon are very good at that. That's how they move north so quickly, and occupied other habitats. So yeah, increasing production in the southern regions, likely, with the warming in the Chukchi and the Beaufort, is going to increase the number of strays north. I just think you're already seeing that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela, and thanks, Ed. There was a question sent to me in the chat box that's sent privately, and that is, which salmon species has the most plasticity in terms of spawning sites?
Well, it's pink salmon are very versatile, and chum salmon are too, but I think it's the pinks that they're most versatile. They're going to find habitat outside. Most salmon species are going to come back and spawn in their natal streams. There is some straying for sockeye and some for Chinook, but the ones that are most plastic or it's pink salmon. They take advantage of new habitats.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully that answers that viewer's question. The one I had was the Russian question. So we're transboundary, right? And so what are our neighbors seeing? Do you have insight or into that? In January of 2020, right before all this pandemic, there was a big USSR meeting on marine mammals. I go to that and I learn about salmon. And in there, at the end of it was the information. They were talking about polar bears, but at the end they said we've never had salmon at Wrangel Island, and we had a run of they said red salmon. Okay. And it sustained the bears, the polar bears. They had 70 bears in this one area that were on the ground. And those bears were fishing in the rivers for these salmon. And they were glad of it, right? The bears were sustained and not bothering. And so the people, are they moving up like that into Russia? I guess was my question. Do you get news of what's happening in our neighborhood on the other side?
Yeah, we discussed this at the North Pacific Adams Fish Commission, and there's an annual meeting. And I do know that production in the northern regions, especially for pink salmon, is increasing. They've noted that now for the last 4 years. They were surprised by it. So in other words, yeah, they're seeing similar increases in production to what we're seeing in the northern Bering Sea.
And whereabouts is that, in the Chukchi? Or
Most of the northern regions, mostly it's the northern region of the Bering Sea.
On the Russian side. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Do you get news of the Chukchi Sea, or would you? Is that too far north?
I don't think that they get much information, at least not at the NPAFC forum on what's going on in the Chukchi.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That was my question there. Any other questions for Ed Farley on pink salmon?
This is Charlie. Can I have a second bite at the apple?
Go for it.
In my experience, to speak to the conflict between pink salmon and other species, not so much salmon, but char and Dolly Varden. So Dolly Varden and char prefer a much colder spawning habitat than pink salmon can tolerate. And you see that here in the Nome area. There's certain tributaries that have really cold springs, and the salmon just shun those. Like on the Nome River, Hobson Creek, to name a name. And then there'll be streams on a wet year that the pink salmon are decoyed into, and they'll colonize that creek really heavily. But the downside is that there are no springs in those small streams, and they dry out, and you'll find this time of year when you go poking around, a bunch of desiccated carcasses stranded, on bare ground, and I'm sure the eggs are in the same condition. So as you say, pink salmon are opportunists, but sometimes it doesn't work for them. So I wanted to point that out. In my career, I watched pink salmon colonize the Willick and Kivalina rivers in Kotzebue and Fish Creek on the north shore of Hotham Inlet, and the locals there were surprised, as I was, that they were there. And so I watched that expansion occur back in the 90s, and it was fun. I guess they're keeping on going. So anyway, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Ed. Actually, Gamble was on the phone and they were trying to be heard. But they seem to have gotten off the phone. I know they're having trouble, but they have been texting saying, we can't hear us. So we haven't been able to hear them trying to. And they're gone right now, so they probably lost the connection, but they were on for your presentation, and it looks like we just lost them, so that's too bad. There's one more caller, but I don't know where they're calling in from. It is the Alaska number.
Oh. Hi, Gay. This is Jared from Gamble.
Hi, Jared from Gamble. Okay, well done. Welcome. Do you have a question for Ed?
No, yeah, I got a question for the guy, the fish guy. You mentioned that they were counting in Norton Sound, Bering Strait, Norton Sound. Where would they be counting fish in Norton Sound area?
Did you get the question, Ed? Where were you counting the fish in the Norton Sound area? I think maybe because they're calling, they cannot see the map that you showed. So maybe you can explain.
Oh, sure. So the juvenile pink salmon that are being caught in the northern Bering Sea region are within Norton Sound in the northern Bering Sea from 60 north up to the Bering Strait and as far offshore as St. Lawrence Island.
It looked like on his map, Jared, they were going maybe, were you going, I guess you can't show your map again, but is it the sort of the same area where the Wild Brit and the NOAA bottom trawl surveys are?
Yes.
Okay. Does that help, Jared?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Hey, Jared, while you're on the phone, do you have anything about the salmon that you're seeing or catching at Gamble? I know there's been a lot of rod and reel action at the point. That seems kind of new to me, but I don't know. Are you seeing any changes?
A lot. This is Marina.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yep.
Hey, just these past few years, maybe 2-3 years, a lot of people have been catching more salmon than anything else by rod and reel.
Off the point?
Big salmon, like, yeah, at the point, at the North Beach and West Beach. Maybe like 2 feet, 2.5 feet.
Do you know what that would be, Ed? 2.5 foot?
Sounds like Chinook. King salmon.
I think there have been king salmon. I've seen some photos of really large, large fish being taken by rod and reel, and they're colored. you know, they're colored up. They're not silver anymore. They're getting ready. So thank you very much. That's very interesting to hear about more salmon, and especially those big ones. I don't know. We do have Lyle Britt on the phone. If he has, or he's on the computer, but he's listening in. If he has anything to say on the fish, because he's been working with Gamble and on those bottom trawl surveys, letting people know what they're finding. Do you have any thoughts, Lyle, on what the kinds of salmon you might be catching at Gamble, those big ones? Putting you on the spot, Lyle.
He's on a computer with no microphone.
Oh, he's on a computer with no microphone. Okay. Sorry, put you right on the spot. Oh, thanks. Sorry about that. Anyway, they're either king salmon, I'm sure, or just a big giant coho, maybe.
Yeah, could be that too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gamble, and thank you for coming to Straight Science. Appreciate it. Hopefully this has been of interest. And if you have I'm going to offer you up, and if people have questions this summer about the survey or any of what they're doing at sea, please feel free to give a call, and I'm sure Ed would be very happy to talk to the council.
Yep.
Oh, here we go. Lyle Britt added, sadly, I'm on a computer with no microphone, but Ed will know more on the salmon. We rarely get them in our bottom trawl survey. In Norton Sound near Nome, we have caught a couple of pinks over the years, but that's it. So you're missing some, Ed. So thank you, Lyle. Thanks. All right. Any other questions for Ed Farley regarding the incredible success story? If your young pink salmon like warm river water for survival, then it ought to be a banner year for an odd year, because we do not even have slush on the rivers anymore. It is very warm here in Nome, as I'm sure throughout the region. We are wide open for warm and moist until at least into next week as well, I believe. So thank you so much, Ed. I don't know if you want to stay on the line for a second. People can hop off. It's always nice to show a little love for Ed in the chat box. That's always nice. For the speaker. Oh, you got a thumbs up from the animal doctor. Well done.
All right, well, thank you.
Jim Dory does ask you a question. At what point is it going to be too warm for the fish?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we're just moving into a sweet spot now for pink salmon, chum salmon, and sockeye in the Bering Sea. So it's going to be a while. If you look at the Gulf of Alaska and the story that happened over there when we had the warm blob, that was much higher temperatures, and that was too warm. It's hard to put into context, but I would think it would be quite some time before those temperatures, or if they would ever show up in the Bering Sea.
All right.
But they have shown up in the Gulf.
So enjoy what we have while we've got it, I guess, is the moral to that. So thank you, Ed. Thank you. And Jim says thanks. So you answered his question. That's great. All right, so we've only got a couple more people, but you're all welcome to end. We're at the end, so thank you so much.